In October, I debuted the Bad Structure Deck series, an ongoing set of videos where I take a look at older structure decks and analyze why they're terrible, and you guys seem to really like it. And I'm going to put that series on hold until 2018 because I really wanted to end 2017 with a huge project that I've been planning and that you guys have even given your own contributions to, and that is the worst card in every structure deck. Now, there are a crap ton of TCG structure decks, and in this series, I'm going to take a look at the single worst card out of each deck. Now, this is going to be fun because in bad structure decks, there may be multiple cards that sort of are vying for this worst card spot, but in the good structure decks where every card is good, it gets a little trickier to pick out which one is actually the worst. This sort of first list here was made on live stream, and a lot of your guys' inputs really helped make these decisions because many of these were really close. A lot of these structure decks have 2 or 3 really bad cards, but I think we have a really solid list. These ones in this video are going to go from Structure Deck Dragon's Roar, which is the very first structure deck, all the way up to Structure Deck Machine Revolt. So we have a whole bunch of things to cover in this video, and let's get started. So Structure Deck Dragon's Roar is all about Red Eyes, Darkness Dragon, and the single most worst card we could find was the Graveyard in the 4th Dimension. There are a lot of bad cards in this structure deck. The Red Eyes Bee Chick is pretty bad. Interdimensional Matter Transporter is pretty bad, but by and large, the Graveyard in the 4th Dimension is utter trash. There are a lot of problems with this card. First of all, it's not a very good card no matter what, but in relation to the structure deck, there was only 2 level monsters. There were 2 copies of Armed Dragon level 3 and 2 copies of Armed Dragon level 5. So for the Graveyard in the 4th Dimension to truly get value, you had to set up this imaginary scenario where you went through Armed Dragon level 3 and Armed Dragon level 5, you played Graveyard in the 4th Dimension, recycled both of them in your deck, and then you somehow got to the Armed Dragon level 3 again to start the cycle anew. But at the end of the day, most of the times what you'd be doing is activating Graveyard in the 4th Dimension, shuffling 2 cards back. You just took a -1 for no reason, and then you'll never see those cards ever again, and you'll probably lose the game, making this the first worst card on the list. Now, second, we have Structure Deck Samba Madness. Now, this deck is all about special summoning zombies, and I actually think it's a fairly decent structure deck, but by far the worst card in it was Soul Absorbing Bone Tower. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to bring up some old FTK versions that use Soul Absorbing Bone Tower, and while those decks did have mild success at a few shonen jumps, in general, this card is just so misplaced in the Samba Madness structure deck. The Samba Madness structure deck is all about gaining card advantage and special summoning big zombies. It's really not trying to mill the opponent out. Now, I will give Soul Absorbing Bone Tower a little bit of credit because when it came out, sort of milling cards from your opponent's deck wasn't nearly as bad as it would be right now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! The Graveyard is essentially the second hand, and you really would not want to use this effect. But back in the day, a lot of times you were hitting pretty powerful spells, but still, this thing's way too slow, it dies way too easily, and does not really have any synergy with the rest of the deck. There's almost 0 times when you want to summon this card over any other card that you have, making it the worst card in the structure deck. Now, on to Structure Deck Blaze of Destruction, which was the most recent bad structure deck review. This one was a little tough. A lot of people thought that certain cards were worse than others. I think it came down to Foxfire, Dark Room of Nightmare, and Meteor of Destruction. We ended up going with Foxfire. Foxfire is so bad. The thing that a lot of people miss about this card is that its revival effect only triggers if it's face up at the start of the damage step when it's attacked, which means you actually have to summon this thing and then have it die by battle to jumpstart the end of turn Graveyard special summoning effect. That's pretty bad because you're going to be taking a lot of damage considering it only has 300 attack points. If this card had the one single change to make it so it didn't have to be face up when it was destroyed, it might be semi-playable, but the fact that it has that restriction and the fact that you can't even tribute it for a tribute summon, even though it's clearly a card that's designed to be like Treeworn Frog, is just utterly ridiculous. The card does have pretty cool artwork, which a lot of people noted, but overall, it's just like the most unusable card in the entire deck. Moving on, we have Structure Deck Fury from the Deep, and this one was tough because, as you guys might have remembered, I featured this video in the Good Structure Deck series. It's the only good Structure Deck I featured, and the worst card, in my opinion, was Starboy. Now, I will mention that Little Chimera was in Blaze of Destruction, and that did not make this list because that one had so many other trash cards. But because Fury from the Deep is an actual good structure deck, it's really hard to find like bad cards in it, but Starboy is probably the worst. The boost effect is simply not worth it. Even if you have a Legendary Ocean on the board, Starboy is only at 1250. Your opponent can simply run it over by battle, making the 500 boost pretty pointless. So Starboy, even though it's not like the worst card in the world, in context of Fury from the Deep, it's by far the least usable and the card that you never want to actually draw. Now, Warrior's Triumph was an auto pick. This card was featured in a bad structure deck from a couple weeks ago, and I remember as soon as I clicked to this structure deck to go through the card list again, that my least favorite card was Fairy of the Spring. I talk about cards in the structure decks a lot where they have these unnecessary restrictions put on them, even though they wouldn't be good without those restrictions, and Fairy of the Spring is the perfect example of this, because Fairy of the Spring would not be good if it just added an equip spell back from your graveyard. That is not good enough. Even if it added 2 equip spells, it might still not be good enough. However, the fact that you only get to add 1 equip spell, and the fact that you can't even use that equip spell that turn, makes this card so bad. It's just ridiculously slow in a deck that really doesn't need a card like this. You might as well just play other equip spells, and I just don't know why it's even... I mean, I guess I understand why it's in the structure deck because it kind of goes with the theme, but it's so bad, and once again, you never want to draw this card. It's just not worth it. A 1-turn clock to sort of play an equip spell is just really bad. Moving on, we have structure deck Spellcaster's Judgment. And this one was tough because it came down to the White Magician Pikaru and the Black Magician counterpart, but the White Magician is by far the worst card. Both these cards are terrible. They have 1200 attack and they're expected to live throughout your turns to actually gain any value, but I would say that the White Magician one is significantly worse only because it's only gaining you life points versus doing damage to your opponent. The Black Magician, I guess, had some sort of fringe uses by sort of locking your opponent down with level limit area B or gravity bind to do a mediocre amount of damage every single turn, but doing damage is just infinitely better than gaining life points, so White Magician Pikaru just has to be on this list. That deck in general had a lot of other bad cards in it, but these cards are so bad. There's no scenario where you're going to summon White Magician Pikaru and is actually going to live until your next standby phase, and then even if you manage to get that done, you're just gaining a couple life points. It's just not worth it at all. Moving on, we have structure deck Invincible Fortress. This one was pretty hard to decide. People were fairly conflicted with it. I ended up going with Canyon. Canyon, I believe, is the worst card in structure deck because as soon as you activate it, it basically counteracts every single thing you're trying to do with the deck, because the whole point of the deck is that your opponent is attacking into face-down defensive position monsters and taking a lot of damage, but as soon as you activate Canyon, your opponent will not attack you unless they have a fairly large attack monster on the board, and that's really not what you're trying to do. Yeah, it's cool sort of making it so your opponent skips a few battle phases, but in the long run, Canyon is just a -1 that's basically no better than Nightmare's Steel Cage, because eventually they're just going to hit it with an MST. Canyon doesn't do anything. It doesn't have any impact, and compared to a card like a Legendary Ocean, which was released a year before Canyon at least, it's just surprising that Canyon has no other effect. It doesn't have a protection effect for itself. It doesn't give rock monsters extra defense. It doesn't really do anything besides that double damage effect, but as soon as you actually have this card, your opponent's never going to trigger that effect anyway, making it pretty damn useless. Next, we have structure deck Lord of the Storm. This one's a fun one. There are a lot of really weird cards in the structure deck that don't really have any great synergy, but I think by far the strangest choice for the structure deck was Harpy Girl. Yes, it has the Harpy tagline, and a lot of people, or a lot of the cards in the deck actually required you to have Harpies, but Harpy Girl is just so misplaced. It has 500 attack, and while it synergizes with a few things in the deck, there's like no situation where you actually want to summon this card. I get that they had to include it in this deck because there was really nothing else you could put this in. I mean, I guess it's like pack filler, but that's really not even that useful. But so maybe Harpy Girl's like fan service to weird people, but other than that, I don't see any reason for this card to even exist in the first place, let alone be put into a structure deck that is marketed as playable out of the box, because it sure as hell isn't playable if you keep Harpy Girl in it. Next, we have structure deck Dinosaurs Rage. This one, once again, was pretty tricky. There's that really bad egg card. There's Baby Sarasaurus, which in that structure deck wasn't very good, even though it eventually became very good. There's Black Terra. That card's not very good either. But I think by far the worst card, we have Goblin Out of the Frying Pan. And I actually think Goblin Out of the Frying Pan is one of the worst cards ever printed in Yu-Gi-Oh! It is truly just a sight to behold, because it almost always doesn't do anything. You don't even negate, I mean, you negate the spell, but then they just get it back anyway, so they can just play it a second time. The only time this card is ever even remotely useful is to make your opponent pay double the cost for a spell card, but that is such a specific application that most likely will not happen. And not to mention, you have to set this card first. Like, I know I dogged on Dark Bribe a lot, but really, if you're playing Goblin Out of the Frying Pan, please just play Dark Bribe instead. Way better, way more versatile. It doesn't just, I mean, this card does nothing. At least Malfunction, which is the trap equivalent of Goblin Out of the Frying Pan, at least putting the trap back actually does something, because your opponent then can't activate it until the next turn. But with Goblin Out of the Frying Pan, they can just activate the spell card again, so like it's so bad. Geez, this card, I don't know why they printed this. I mean, even when we have a card like Pot of Desires where the cost is so steep, no one is playing a card this bad just to counter it. Lastly, we have Structure Deck Machine Revolt. This one introduced the gadgets to the game, if I remember correctly, and it had a whole bunch of Ancient Gear monsters in it. The worst card in it is actually just the Ancient Gear, as in the level 2 monster. Some people debated that this card was not that bad, but I think that they are living in a dream world if they actually think Ancient Gear is even somewhat playable, because even though the card can be machine duped, and even though you can make a rank 2 with it, that does not necessarily make this card good. If they just print level 2 machines with 500 attack that are normal monsters, those cards aren't suddenly good because you can machine dupe them. And because of that, Ancient Gear is just terrible. Not to mention, this deck only had 2 copies of it, so like I don't see the strategy where like and there was no giant rat either. So it's like you summon Ancient Gear to special summon an Ancient Gear, and then you just pass turn and hope nothing happens to him. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't know why. Like, imagine if like every archetype had like a card that was named specifically after the archetype that was just like utter trash. Like, that'd be such a weird thing to set up with every single theme. It's like a card called Burning Abyss, and it's just like discard your entire hand, do nothing, take 5,000 damage. I don't know, but Ancient Gear, terrible. Anyway, though, that's going to wrap up part 1 of this series. We got a lot of other bad cards coming up, and actually the day before I upload this, I will have done another live stream sort of talking about which cards are bad in each structure deck, and I hope to do possibly 1 more of those live streams, if not 2 more of those live streams, to get a lot of people's input, because many of the ones on the list were not my first choice, but then after sitting down, talking through it, and thinking through it, I figured out that they were in fact the worst cards in each structure deck. Let me know what you guys think, though. Maybe I got some wrong, maybe you don't agree with them, and I will see you guys later. Bye.